Hello. Fisher Room, last talk before lunch, but don't let your stomach compete with the content, which is awesome. Kris has been involved with Puppet for a number of years, representing, I think, the spiritual heart of the European Puppet using community. I kind of made that up, but when you hear his accent, it'll sound really true, I think. 7 tools for your Puppetized DevOps stack. Kris.
Hey, thanks. So I'm not the thing keeping you from lunch. I'm the person keeping you from waiting in line for 10 more minutes. So I can easily do 10 more minutes because you have to wait anyhow. So I'm Kris. This talk is titled 7 Tools for Your DevOps Stack. I quickly looked in the audience, and I don't think anybody's seen this content before. There are a couple of people around here that did. So my background, I'm from Belgium. That's Europe. So I started my career about 15, 20 years ago, purely as a software development, wrote in all kind of crappy languages, Java, C, Perl, PHP. And I was always the guy who was putting stuff in production. I was the guy who was racking the servers, installing the operating system, and basically doing all that stuff. So I kind of became an operations person because I needed to. Today my role is I'm the guy who triggers all my other team members at Inuits, which is an open source company with offices in all over Europe, to go to the next step. I troll them into getting better stuff out there. And you might know me from my blog, which is called Everything is a Fucking DNS Problem. So this talk is titled 7 Tools for Your DevOps Stack, but first you need to know what DevOps is. So there was a period 10 years ago. I was going to a lot of conferences, talking to a lot of people, lots of people whose names are up on the list. Actually, people that have been speaking here or are speaking in other rooms right now. That was the hour before. And we were constantly talking about the problem, how do you go from a piece of source code and put that into production? And when it's in production, how do you actually keep it up and running? Which is probably a problem all of you are dealing with these days. And that eventually led to Patrick Dubois and me meeting at some cloud camp in Antwerp, where we basically said, look, there's velocity in the US, but there's nothing really in Europe. And we pretty much said, let's organize this conference, let's do something. And that was the first DevOps Days in Ghent back in 2009. It was a really small conference, 60, 70 people. And we had a format where we had formal talks in the morning and open spaces in the afternoon. And that format was something that was really good. Lots of people came back from that event saying, this was the best conference I've been to in years. And well, it went on and on. Mountain View, Hamburg. Next week we'll be in Rome. It's going to be awesome. So hope to see a couple of you guys there. And what we didn't do is actually put up a definition. So there's no real definition of what it is. There's a group of people. It's a professional movement. It's a cultural movement. And we definitely don't have all the answers yet. We're looking. We're trying to solve these problems. And we're reaching out to different communities. We've been seeing different conferences like DrupalCon or Java conferences putting up dedicated tracks on how to deal with their problem space and how to make that more DevOpsy. So it's basically something that has been around for years. We've been doing this kind of work for 5, 10 years. It's only now that there's a new name, and it's a common name where everybody can actually talk about the same topic and say, look, this is DevOps. So I want to give you a real definition. Jos knows what it is. Who else recognizes this? Who was in John Willis's talk last hour? This is Deming. This is almost 30 years old. And when you go into an organization and you ask, do you like this? They all say, yes. Do you do this? No. It still doesn't define what DevOps is, but Damon Edwards and John Willis had a good definition a couple of years ago. And they basically broke down DevOps to 4 things. It's about culture. It's about how do you deal with getting new people involved? How do you deal with failure? How do you deal with teaching stuff? How do you deal with how does your organization work? It's about automating stuff, automate all the things. It's about measuring stuff, what goes wrong, what goes right, how many it deploys, how much data traffic, everything. And it's about sharing stuff. So let's dig a bit deeper into these things. Let's talk about culture first. Ages ago, and still in a lot of organizations, this is the way operations people and developers are working together. It's basically a mud fight. They're throwing stuff at each other, they're fighting. And can you blame them? This is the kind of books operations people were reading and bragging about. And security people have similar books, and we like these things, right? Oh, what's your username? You need more disk space? Here you go, and sure, absent. So this whole culture thing is about getting people to work together. It's about breaking silos. If you look at kindergarten, there's little kids when they're really young, when they're 2, 3-year-old, they play in their own isolated corners. They play with their own toys and they fight. And if somebody takes away a piece of toys, then they're angry. And it's basically little kids playing. And when they grow up, they start working together, they start playing together, and it becomes much more fun. So there's a tool which allows you to let people work together. There's a tool which allows you to get them closer together. Who knows what tool that is? Beer. Too bad I couldn't get real beer into the country, but you know, I'm from Belgium, you get the idea. Don't get too heavy on those. Those are really killers if you want to. So culture, it's probably one of the most difficult things to do. It's probably one of the things where you have to spend most time on, but it is important. You cannot do DevOps. DevOps is not just automation. It's not just setting up a bunch of tools somewhere and expecting them to work. The first part is really communicating and talking to each other. If you don't break down the silos, if you don't cross the bridge to the other side of the building, then it's never going to work. But there's other components which you need. You need automation. You need to be able to automate all the things. And there's a bunch of tools, bunch of things we've already solved. I mean, we can auto-deploy machines. We can do configuration management. That's a solved problem, right? There's a lot of challenges, however, that we still need to tackle. Like, how do you get developers to actually build, test, and deploy software the right way? How do we deal with repositories? How do you deal with software repositories, and who can access them, and how do you manage those? And how do you deal with large-scale orchestration? So I typically work in environments where I have a bunch of developers that need to get stuff into production. And to do that, they've heard about tools like continuous integration and all this stuff. And I like to use Jenkins for that, because it's an open source tool, it's an integration server, it has a zillion plugins, well, 400 according to their site. They're actually Puppet users. I don't know if our Tyler's in the room, but he wrote a Puppet module to manage Jenkins. Their whole infrastructure is being managed by Jenkins. And to me, it serves two goals. On one side, it's the traditional continuous integration setup, where you get a software developer to actually check his code, build tests, run tests, do full scenarios, so you eventually end up with reliable software. But as a Puppet user, we're also using Jenkins to actually test our Puppet code. So this is an example of a pipeline, the way we're using it, which is basically first checking out software in its own workspace, then running all Tim's tool on it, basically running syntax checks, running style checks, and then we package the stuff, and it ends up on a pull repository. So it's a really cool tool to actually put in place a workflow where everybody knows how stuff goes from source to production. There's 2 Puppet modules today out there. There's one of our customers which forked the module we've been working on. There's our Tyler modules. And if you look on Jan's repository, there's actually Jenkins jobs that can be used to do style checks, to do reporting and all this stuff with Puppet. So one of the steps I had in the pipeline was packaging stuff. Now, you know, packaging sucks. There's all kinds of different types of packages. Nobody actually can use something that's available upstream because it's ancient. It doesn't match with the dependencies you have. You have unneeded dependencies. I mean, yeah, getting LSB involved, do you need all that stuff? So if you want to package your own software, it's pretty hard to get it inside a distribution. It's pretty impossible to get a fairly recent tool and get it into EPEL, because you have to get it into Fedora and all this stuff. Nobody wants to go through that hassle. But you want to have a platform where you can uniquely identify where a file is coming from. It's coming either from a package or it's configuration management. At least that's my philosophy. So Jordan, who's sitting in the back and who needs a lot of beer later today, basically wrote a tool called FBM because he was frustrated and he was pissed off and he wanted to do a tool that solved the problem. And now with FBM, you can basically take all of these inputs and a lot more, package them with a simple command line and probably much more now too. Those are the ones we use. Well, not the Solaris one, but it was on his slide. So. And the way you do this is pretty simple. It's just a target, which is the RPM. In this case, the source. We're packaging Hornet Q, the version, and outro as a package. And the Java developers like this because it's simple. It's not having to deal with Maven anymore and getting the RPM plugin to work. And we like it because we actually get packaged stuff. So we even went a step further because who likes to have Ruby gems as dependencies? And we have a lot of setups where Ruby is in place, and we were really struggling with gems and having those files all around. So we now maintain a list, which is a bunch of Ruby gem packages, which we want to build using FPM, and we basically push them out to a pulp repository. And if you forget repository and you send us a pull request, the next thing you get is 5 minutes later, it's that version packaged. Currently, we are pushing them onto Yum repositories. We are working on getting into Debian repositories. But you basically get on-demand builds of modules. We have the same with Nagios plugins. We're doing the same with Jenkins plugins. We're working on Python and Peer stuff. So we are building a fully self-service FPM-based Yum and apt repository with these tools. So now you have the software the developer wrote packaged, and you're using Puppet to install it, but there's still a bunch of unused machines around. There's still a bunch of machines that are not in line. And what I happened to have a lot of times was talking to developers in a new environment and questioning them about why they were using so many different versions of a package. And they basically told me, well, we're not using that many versions of a package. So there's a tool, and I like to use it for a lot of stuff, but this is one of the real use cases to get developers and operations people together. It's mCollective. So Ari will probably, well, I already told him, it's not really distributed as SSH, it's much better. But my first use case for using mCollective, and that's ages ago, was what's running on which machine? Just give me feedback on which versions of software I have installed. It's also a really cool tool if you say you have a Puppet master, you accidentally destroy it because you can rebuild it, but then your CA is completely screwed, and now you need to basically re-sign all the certs and clean all the certs and all the servers. Just one or two mCollective comments. So when you go in to talk to developers, you can ask mCollective stuff like, hey, where's Apache running? On which machines in acceptance is Apache running? Or, you know, you guys told me you only had one GDK. Nah, you don't. You have a lot more GDKs than you tell me you have. And this brings back the point where you have a tool which allows you to bring a communication with other people. It allows you to not go in there and guess, well, I think we have 2 versions of the GVM. No, we can count them. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's really a lot of versions. And then you can start talking to them and figuring out why. And that conversation is the one you want to have with your developers. So we talked about culture. We talked about automation. The next thing we need to do is measure stuff. And measuring stuff means monitoring stuff. So who likes monitoring? Only 5 people, so the rest of you really loves monitoring sucks. So I kind of think of monitoring sucks as a sub-movement of the DevOps movement. It kind of was pretty much the same people. They were running into the problems. They were figuring out that, well, all of these, 5-minute intervals, having to define fake hosts, dealing with tools that were awesome on a user interface, but really you couldn't automate them, like Zabbix and Xenas up till 2 years ago, constantly changing API and try to deploy 1,000 instances of those. Well, couldn't do that. I had a study in 2009 at Otto Linux Symposium, And we basically took all the open source monitoring tools around. And came down to 4 or 5 that we thought that would be relevant. And it actually came down back to 1. And it was plain old Nagios. Okay, we use Ichinga because, well, it's much more advanced and it has a way more active community in Europe. But it came down to finding a tool that allows you to just write out a configuration, generate it based on your configuration management tool. Today there's new stuff. There's tools like Graphite, tools like Ichinga, Flapjack, but there's a bunch of old tools around which allow you to do stuff. Ganglia is getting new traction, all that stuff. But it still sucks. I mean, if you really want to build a good network monitoring setup, you need to do something like this. So you take a Java app, you monitor that with expose GMX, you do GMX trans, send GMX trans to Graphite or OpenTSDB. You take your logs on a separate tool, send them to Logster or to Logstash, and then basically, well, here's Logstash. You can do some stuff with Esper and trigger alerts, but it's glue. It's getting stuff together. So what are your hosts doing? What are your Puppet manifests doing? Oh, you want to report that with Foreman, and then we need to tape all of this stuff together, and it still sucks. So lots of people now are thinking about taking one of the components, this one here, or another component, and throw stuff onto a queue, and then have that queue being able to, on one side, have input, where people are throwing data on there, throwing metrics on there, do some stuff in the middle, mangle the data, and on the other side, you can have multiple consumers for that. So one of the tools to do that is Logstash. Another shout out to Jordan. He really needs beer tonight. He's one of the guys, just like Tim, just like Ari and Patrick, who keep writing cool stuff. It's amazing what those guys do. I don't know when they sleep, even with little kids. I sleep much more than they do, I guess. But so this is not just a tool to collect logs. It's basically a tool which allows you to capture stuff on one side, do stuff, and then output it to another side. Typically set up as a shipper, an indexer, and a web interface. It has a bunch of inputs, a bunch of filters, and a bunch of outputs. And I think this list is already outdated. And you can get developers to use this. So one of the first use cases I had with this was basically a QA department that was looking at log files. And they were constantly tailing stuff. And just by adding Logstash in the mix, growing all the log files, throwing them at the console, they had this. And they could just see what was going on. They could really see the actual exceptions on the application stack in a GUI next to each other. Now, with all respect for Jordan, I don't really like this interface. It kind of sucks. It's terrible. So this is what most people use, Kibana. Or they send stuff to Graylog. So why does this fit in this talk? Well, there's Puppet modules to actually deploy all of that. There's, on my GitHub repository, a full setup which includes Logstash, Kibana, Grub, Elasticsearch, and all the stuff in there. And it's as trivial as getting it to work as cloning the module, then do a submodule in it, because all the Puppet modules are in sub-modules of the project, submodule updates, and then Vagrant. And we'll come back to Vagrant later. So that's one part. Now you have a tool to actually collect logs, to collect stuff, and send all that. Now you want to visualize that, and not just the log files. You want to basically visualize a bunch of things. And then comes Graphite. And the real power in Graphite for me is really this. It's that trivial to send metrics to it. It's just echo some string, some value, timestamp, netcat it to a port, and it will start doing. It's so easy. I mean, it takes you literally 5 minutes to set it up. The real problem becomes, what do I want to graph and how do I get the metrics there? Graphite, if you install it by default, it has a web interface which is ugly like hell, and people start being confused when using it. But this is actually just the default tool which allows you which metrics you have and to build new graphs with it. So you can take 1 or 2 metrics in here. You can apply functions on them, like give me the derivative of all that stuff, just draw a full line when some event occurs. And it's really interesting to start playing with this, because this really makes events visible on your platform. Now, what it does in the background is, this is an image, and it's basically a tool to generate that image. And if you look at the URL on top, you can actually make this manually. And this is where developers come in again. They can send you metrics. They can build stuff that sends data to Graphite. But it can also build dashboards, which is basically generating the URL for them, and which they then can slow. And they really love to play with this. They want to see what's going on, but what if I combine those? And developers then start building dashboards which make things visible in your environment. So Graphite has a lot of friends. People use statsd to collect statistics and send those to Graphite. So sometimes there's chains where people send logs to Logstash based on the number of logs you get, number of the entries, you send those to statsd counts, and then flushes to Graphite. There's collectd, which has a Carbon plugin. Carbon then collects the stat. There's people using JMX trans to get all the Java stuff there. You could use logs to run all the thing, and that's just for data collection, but there's much more that already exists. And there's also people that have built dashboards to making those graphs visible easier. I started out using Tattle, because Tattle was a tool that had alerting, which could send out mails when graphs went up or down beyond a certain level. But these days, I'm actually not using that anymore, because we use check Graphite from our Nagios instances, and I'm much more playing with Gdash, a tool written by Ari Pinar. I know it's bootstrap-based, but this is a really easy tool to just build different dashboards and put different graphs next to each other on a screen, or be able to zoom in them. It has a nice menu structure upstairs where you can just put in anything you want. So once again, all of this is as simple as installing as cloning a GitHub repository. This is a Vagrantbox, which has both Graphite, Gdash, GMX trans, Logster, collectd, statsd, Tattle, and a lot of other stuff in there with examples on how to use them. Again, as simple as doing git clone, git submodule init, get it, and Vagrant up, and you got a fully working setup. That, by the way, is the module that won the bounty. The Logstash module was the fork of mine that won the bounty. And I still don't know what I'll get for that, but James will tell me later. So that brings us to, we talked about culture, we talked about automation, we talked about measurement. What's the fourth one again? Sharing, yeah. So 10 years ago, when you were a system administrator and you wanted to share stuff to the open source community, what could you do? You could talk about your experiences, you could write documentation. Back then I was writing a lot of how-tos, talking a lot about how I did stuff, explaining how I did my cluster setups, explaining how I deployed stuff. But, well, with Puppet, it's becoming so much more easier to actually share your code, to share the manifests and the modules you've been writing to other people. So open source is becoming even much more important for system administrators. Rather than just using all the open source tool, we now can really actively contribute to a lot of that. I think GitHub was a really accelerator in that process. The fact that you could just directly look into code and start playing with it was so much easier than SourceForge or whatever. And people talk much more about their experiences. Like 5 to 10 years ago, can you imagine Google or Spotify talking about how they manage their operations internally? Last year at DevOps Days in Göteborg, we had Spotify talking about how they did that. We had Facebook talk about at FOSDEM how they did stuff, and that's just not something we saw 5 years ago. And obviously, people at different types of conferences start doing much more open spaces and share their experiences there. But there's another thing. Sharing development environments between developers and operating people. Basically giving a developer the opportunity to develop software on exactly the same platform he will deploy on. Share code and have shared repositories where you can have the code base for the application, and then another submodule have the actual code base for how you deploy it. And some of you might already have seen Mitchell's talk yesterday, but the most awesome tool for me is Vagrant. It's an abstraction layer for VirtualBox. It integrates with all the configuration management tools. And to me, every project I start is basically a Vagrant project in which I have a Puppet module tree, Puppet manifest tree, and then the actual source code. And those are 3 submodules, but if a developer checks out the Vagrantbox, he can start playing with everything. It's portable, it's small, it's really easy. Just to look at a small config file, you can have MongoDB set up on 2 machines, and developers get this. They know that they can change the IP address and do trivial stuff. It's not difficult anymore. It's Vagrant init, provision, all that stuff. So now you can actually share the same platform with a developer that he knows is going to have the same versions of software, the same libraries, everything as it will run in production. So what's the next thing to share? We should all go out for lunch and have sushi. But there's one really big tool I forgot. Which one? What's the biggest tool I forgot? Well, you need a chef to cook the sushi, but you were talking about something different. No. Nobody? The biggest tool is you. It's not about the tools. It's not about which technologies you use. I don't even care if you use Chef or Puppetized Engine, as long as you use one. But it's about starting the communication, engaging with your peers and engaging with the people around me. Because all these tools alone will not help you. You really need to reach out to the people that write software, that deploy software. You really need to get the conversation starting. And that is much more important than using a bunch of these tools. So there's a bunch of links for all the tools that were in this talk, like M Collective and all the stuff. I'll put the slides online like whenever I get a not shaky network connection. And apart from that, I'm open for questions. There's Damon. You're late.
Have you tried using Pencil as the dashboarding engine?
So the question is if I've used Pencil. No, haven't looked at it yet. There's only 24 hours in a day, and sometimes you have to sleep. And yeah, over there. What about Graylog? So I looked into Graylog, and I couldn't really map it to where it would fit my use cases. I started talking to people, asking them why they use Graylog, and most people told me we use Graylog because it's a much nicer web interface to a Logstash backend than it is. And to me, Kibana solves that. Now, I do realize that there's a bunch of other features like authentication and user restrictions, which Graylog could do. But this was 7 tools. I can probably find a bunch of other tools and make it the 20 tools for your stack. But Graylog is definitely one of the tools you could use in a setup. Yeah. Other questions?
Have you found anything better that integrates your alerting with Nagios and your data visualization with Graphite?
So we're currently using check Graphite, and that basically allows me to define if over a period of time things have been changing, and I trigger on those kind of things. For example, we check the queue length of a Hornet queue if there's too many items staying on a queue for too long. If it stays on a queue for half an hour and then goes down, developers don't care. But if they actually have a couple of 100 messages on a queue and they stay there for hours and hours, then they really want to know. And we use check Graphite for stuff like that. That's a Nagios plugin, yeah. But we use it with the King app, same plugins. More questions?